Hello, my name's Florence. Welcome to TheObsPod. I'm an NHS obstetrician, hoping to share some thoughts and experiences about my working life. Perhaps you enjoy Call the Midwife, maybe birth fascinates you, or you're simply curious about what exactly an obstetrician is. You might be pregnant and preparing for birth. Perhaps you work in maternity and want to know what makes your obstetric colleagues tick, or you want some fresh ideas and inspiration. Whichever of these is the case, and for that matter, anyone else that's interested, the ObsPod is for you. Episode 106, Mr ObsPod. So today I'm welcoming to the ObsPod my long-suffering husband, Mr ObsPod.
Hello.
Because I thought it would be interesting to ask his opinion about what it's like being the long-suffering husband of an obstetrician. So I thought to start off with, I'd give a little bit of context. We got engaged when I was a medical student.
We did.
And we got married at the end of my house jobs.
We did.
So my entire obstetric career has been with you at my side. Do you remember, was it always clear to you I wanted to be an obstetrician and gynecologist?
I can't remember that far back, I'm honest, the details. I never remember you wanting to be anything else. I remember vividly those disciplines that you hated. I probably shouldn't mention them live on the podcast. And I remember you always being very interested in obs and gynae. But when you're a house officer, in those days, being a house officer was a completely different experience to what it is today. And it was incredible hours, incredibly grueling. And from my memory, you didn't have much on your mind apart from getting through it and staying alive. It was more when you became what in those days was called senior house officer. At that point, it was very clear to me you wanted to be an obstetrician because you were picking the particular 6-month placements that you needed to achieve that.
Yeah. So I think I don't remember us ever having any kind of discussion about it or the impact that might have on our life as a couple or our life when we eventually had a family.
No, I mean, frankly, when you first get married, I think thinking about a family is just a bit of a way off. And you were a medical student when I met you, and it was always clear you were going to be a doctor, and that was always part of the deal. And it was always for you a vacation. I was just always grateful the NHS chose to pay you because otherwise you'd be doing it for free. So it was never really something that I felt was, I never wished to discuss it, but never felt it was an option for discussion. It'd be like asking you to cut an arm off, to ask you not to be a doctor or not to be an obstetrician.
Yeah, I definitely fit into the vocational category. Yes. You mentioned senior house officer.
Uh-huh.
Do you remember how those early days were? What it was like when I was doing that 1 in 3, 1 in 4 rota and having those first experiences?
Yes, I remember lots of things. I remember vividly your first death when you were a house officer. First time you saw someone die. Or someone young die. I remember, I still remember that and how that was you were in pieces for days. I remember, how the hours. I mean, we didn't have kids. I was working incredibly hard, so in some ways you don't appreciate how difficult it was. But I still have a strong memory of going to visit you in one of the hospitals, and your on-call room, the curtains were held together with surgical clamps. It was the only way to keep the light out. It was like a DOS house. It was awful. and so I do remember just how bad the conditions were in terms of, and it was how hard junior doctors were made to work, and how awful the conditions were, but also fundamentally in most of the placements how happy you were. I mean, there were a few places where the people above you and the team were sort of somewhat unpleasant, but in general it was sort of I remember it being a very happy and fulfilling period for you.
Yeah, and then it was difficult the next step to becoming a registrar because there was a massive cut in training numbers. And I remember you really coaching me before my interview on and really building my confidence that I needed to present myself, I needed to sell myself, and you impressed on me I should be going almost, you'd be lucky to have me.
Yes.
And that's definitely something I got from you. And when I got that really scarce training number, I definitely felt you were my hidden weapon.
Yeah, I do remember that. And for the average listener, I'm not that confident in when I'm pitching, but I did a lot of work pitching for things. And so I had learned over the years that you have to just fake it till you make it almost. And I do remember your initial sort of PowerPoint presentations being dreadful and helping you get them. But I also remember coming home when you did your first audit.
Oh God!
And,
yes.
And sitting with you, and it was technically a spreadsheet because it was in Excel, but there's just this random, just dump of numbers of things you'd collected with no structure, no hypotheses, and just like, what are we going to do with this? You sort of in tears, and so it's probably the point when you realised that sort of academic medicine wasn't for you, but. Yeah, I remember those vividly, but all I did was put a gloss and a spin on the underlying capability. In the end, yes, I could make you come across as more confident, but we didn't lie in anything that went into presentations and what you said. It's just we put your best foot forward, and it wasn't like that when you sort of classic sort of imposter syndrome. It wasn't like that when you got the Kalman number and you got a registrar that you were discovered to be useless and no good at it. You were very successful and did very well.
Yeah, you definitely helped me bring structure to a number of things at points in my career.
Yes.
I would bring the ideas and the feeling and the crazy bit, and you would bring the sense.
Yes.
Yeah. We got to a point where we decided, well, maybe I decided, right, we're going to have kids.
Yes, you definitely. I don't remember having a choice in this discussion.
So, what did that feel like when, obviously, I knew lots about pregnancy and birth, and you knew nothing? Or maybe you did know stuff, but bad stuff, because I brought bad stuff home.
Exactly. So, firstly, you don't come home and talk to me about death and horrible things, because that's what you come home at that point. If something really stressful and stressing happens, you come home and talk about it rather than just a normal day in the office. So I remember going to the NCT classes and you sitting there biting your lip when people were sprouting just ridiculous things. And I remember sort of someone at the very first class saying, the lady running the class saying, what would failure look like? And some other fudge, having a cesarean, right? And I don't think you said it, but I think dying in childbirth would be more of a failure at that point. But that was interesting. I do remember, what's the thing when they attach to your stomach and take the readings? When
the CTG, the fetal heart monitor.
I do remember, I can't remember if it was our first or second daughter, taking the printout
it was the first, our
eldest,
sticking
it in front of your face and going, as you're having contrast, saying, is this good, is this bad, and expecting you to read the CTG whilst you're in labour. And I remember you not being hugely sympathetic at that point. So I remember that. Apart from that, it's such a blur, and it was so stressful. And I can see why your interest, in the mother's experience, because it was pretty stressful periods, but I don't remember being scared, if I can put it like that. I just remember being stressed.
I remember with our eldest daughter when the registrar came in to talk to me. Do you remember that?
I remember the registrar, big rugby playing chap. He's probably some very prestigious consultant somewhere now.
Do you remember what you asked him?
I asked him how long he'd been qualified and how much experience he had.
Yeah, you did.
I thought it was not an unreasonable question at that point, to be honest.
You said something like, "What year registrar are you?"
That's right.
And when he answered, you said, "Oh, that's okay. You're more experienced than she is."
I do remember that. Yeah, and the second time around, we had a very prestigious consultant. That was much easier.
Yeah, and like you say, it was very stressful and somewhat traumatic.
Yes, that's true, and I think it's when I talk to people sometimes about what you do, the patient experience stuff, and one of the things that sticks in my mind is a presentation you gave years ago, where you gave an example of two women giving birth, and where the actual physical situation was almost identical, cesarean for failure to progress. And one of them, you end up feeling like an utter failure, and it's awful. And the thing that does stick in my mind is how utterly drained you were when our first daughter was born. And the second time, you came out feeling positive and empowered and everything else, and actually nothing was different in terms of the physical side of things, but the way in which you'd been talked to, the way in which you'd I still remember that flipping. It's not a paddling pool, and
birthing pool. Yes,
birthing pool. Sitting in the birthing pool with your gas and air the second time around and everything, and it was. That still sticks in my mind. Is how different you felt, how different you were after the two births.
Yeah. They were chalk and cheese. They were radically different, despite the clinical outcome being the same. And you're absolutely right. That's one of the things that's really driven me to get involved in trying to think about women's experience of care, not just the clinical outcome.
Yes.
I also remember you saying to me when you held, I think it was a friend from NCT, you held their baby, and you said that was the first baby you'd ever held. And I suddenly realised that you'd never held a baby, and that I spent every day in, day out, not really holding a baby, but kind of passing a baby on, as it were, and you'd never held a baby.
Well, it's kind of like you and Excel and me and babies, right? So the first time you held a spreadsheet was when I helped you. and the first time I held a baby was at NCT thing, and just, am I going to drop it? Was the head going to fall off? Because people always say you've got to hold the head, and it's like, if you don't, does the head fall off? Just what happens? Babies just die all the time because people haven't held the head. It's all sort of,
Yes. So talking about holding a baby, you're then literally left holding the baby when I went back to work after maternity leave.
Yes.
For me, one of the things that sticks in my mind is that you were one of the few fathers that I knew who had to spend periods of 24 hours on their own with their offspring because I was working.
Yes.
How did you find that?
Well, it was fine.
Did you resent that?
No, I never resented it. It was fine until they could crawl. When you could just leave them on the playmat and they would just gurgle, and that was fine because you could do other stuff. Once they could crawl, a nightmare, because it's just like, No, it's interesting. I've never resented that, and I don't think that's because I'm sort of some wonderful new, enlightened father. I think it's just, once again, it was the deal. It was always going to be the deal. Two, because my job, I was away a lot. So it wasn't like I got to see my kids every evening. other times. So actually that time was important and precious. And no, that was
I think
me.
Because I do remember at that point it being where you were working, it was quite unusual to have a wife that was working too. And
Yes.
I was working, although I was working part-time, obviously having to do nights, weekends, bank holidays was unusual and an imposition that O&G brings to home life. But I remember you always being very supportive and proud, I guess.
Yeah, no, very much so. And I was always proud. And I do remember sort of the number of corporate events we go to for my job, and sort of the men would speak to you and then be then surprised that you were actually working and had a job. And then as soon as you told them obstetrician, they would then regale you with their wife's birth stories, irrespective of what the event was, or so things have changed a lot, I think, in the last 20 odd years or more than that. And I don't think people would necessarily lead with that question in the same way they did.
No, and people when they heard I was a doctor, it was always, oh, GP.
Yes.
Always
yeah.
An assumption that I was a GP.
And so I was always proud of you being a doctor. It was always I had a very capitalist job. Yeah, there was no social worth to what I did, and I was always very aware that in our marriage you were definitely bringing at that point all the social good.
Yeah, we used to talk about me being the social conscience.
Yes, exactly. I was the bank balance and you were the social conscience. Would be the way to describe it at that point.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah.
And then so we had one child, and before we had the other child, I had to take my membership exams. So on top of a small child, there's studying.
Yes.
Did that impact you?
No, I still remember sort of testing you on stage 4 endometrial cancer and looking at these horrible pictures of rotting bits of body in late stage cancer. What's this? Is this stage 4 or is this stage 3? That's sort of stuck in my mind. I don't remember it being it doesn't stick in my mind as, in that sense, being a difficult period. Computer games had just sort of started coming out, like Tomb Raider. So I don't know if I just was a bit typical male and would just go and play computer games. Probably a certain amount of that. No, I remember going for walks in the park with our elder daughter in the buggy and testing you on things. But you're a very smart woman. So frankly, with your exams, the issue was much less you studying for the exams and much more me keeping you calm about the very unlikely outcome that you might fail your exams. It's sort of the emotional support side of you worrying about it.
Yeah.
Was way more challenging than actually, you sitting down and actually have to study for the exams.
Yeah.
That bit was pretty straightforward from memory.
Yeah, and I remember when I got my membership, the weight of relief being absolutely massive that was out of the way. I'd done my professional exams. That was theoretically my last ever exam I needed to take. And you came to my membership award ceremony and then we went out for afternoon tea to celebrate, and I do remember that being a real high point.
No, I remember you getting your Kalman number, passing your exam and getting your consultant job as like the 3 major milestones in your career. They're still stick in my mind as key.
So what do you think was the hardest point during my career?
So 2 bits stick out for me. Firstly, when you're a house officer, long time ago, and people may not remember, but that was in the days before working hours were regulated, and house officers in those days could work up to 100 hours a week. It was incredible, and I wouldn't see you for weeks on end because you were working all the time. And I remember there was a point when the other house officer you were with went sick, for like a 6-week period or something, and you were trying to do 2 house officers' jobs, and you were just physically barely able to cope, and no one was just hearing about it. And it was only, I think, when you were at the point of almost quitting that one of the consultants stepped in and got things fixed a little bit.
Yeah, that's right.
So that sticks in my mind. It's something that doesn't happen anymore, but 6 months has just been a truly awful period. And I think the other time, similar, when you're thinking of quitting, was when we have been around when we had the children. So firstly, when you got pregnant, at that period, I was stunned by how unsupportive the hospitals and some of the consultants were in obstetrics.
Yeah.
I remember a female consultant refusing to have you on her team because you were pregnant, which is just still can't get my head around. And I remember the hospital trying to argue that they shouldn't pay you, or trying to avoid...
They didn't want to pay me my on-call payments because I wasn't going to be doing on-call because of being pregnant.
And I remember we had to get the BMA to call them up and point out that was just basically a massive violation of employment law, and they were like, oh yeah, okay, we'll pay then. So that still sticks in my mind as just...
Yeah, it was a real shock to me how unsupportive the system was to actually being pregnant when you were working in a maternity service, which you felt should understand pregnancy.
I think it's got a lot better since then.
I think it has, and I think the main thing I think has got better is people have keeping in touch days when they're on maternity leave now, and there's much more reintroduction when you come back from maternity leave. And I know someone who set up a fantastic course for trainees that have been out of the system for a little bit, perhaps on maternity leave or for other reasons, to kind of reintroduce them. And there was nothing like that. When I came back from having the children, I literally went back into work and was expected to pick up exactly where I'd left off without any kind of understanding that I might be a bit rusty or need a bit of support. Let alone the fact that you were leaving, certainly the first time, your baby for the first time, potentially. I mean, yeah.
So I remember that, and so linked to that, I remember the low point was when we had 2 small children, I think it was, yeah, and you were working on the North East Deanery in London. So you were driving out an hour and a half sometimes, an hour and a half back, and you had 2 small children. So you'd leave the house the nanny would arrive at 7 in the morning. And you would leave the house at 7 in the morning. I would have left or be leaving or be away, and you'd get back if you're lucky at 7 at night, and the nanny would be would leave. And it's one of the. I mean, frankly, I was away because I had a job, which meant we could afford to pay for a nanny who could work those kind of hours. Because I don't know how people. It'd be impossible with daycare.
Yes.
To do that, and I don't know how people. Cope in that situation.
Yeah, there was definitely a point when the children were both not yet school age, and I just thought, what am I doing this for?
Yeah, and I remember you sort of saying, thinking of giving up, and me sort of saying to you, don't do that, because this is a long-term career, and it's incredibly difficult now, but this is going to be a worthwhile investment as the kids get older. Which
was true. It was.
But I remember you just being impossible. And to be fair, the thing that saved it was interdeanery transfer.
Yeah.
The ability you managed to get a transfer from northeast London to southwest London, and your commute went from like an hour and a half at least to sort of 15 minutes.
Yeah, it was game changer.
And
totally game changer.
So getting the role at Kingston was just a game changer. And once again, I don't know whether that's still a difficult thing to do in deanery transfer. Or even the deaneries. Do you still have 4 deaneries in London now? Or are they?
No, it's
all been merged.
Yeah, it's north and south now.
But also because you were the very first Calman number, so that the NHS make it up as it went along. Didn't know how it was to do it. Didn't know how it worked. Didn't know how to plan for it. So I remember that being a really, really, probably the toughest point. I think that's the one time when I think you were really seriously considering quitting, because it was just so hard. And I'm glad you didn't.
Yeah, and then I had my consultant interview. I remember you really helping me and coaching me for that. I remember actually being in the garden. I think we were shredding things that we'd been cutting in the garden, and I think it was November, and I just remember standing there for hour after hour chopping up this stuff in the garden with you asking me interview questions in preparation, because I really had kind of put all my eggs in one basket. I really desperately wanted to get the job at Kingston, and it meant so much just because it was a place where I was happy and it was close to home, and yeah, it was the right job for me. But then I had to make that transition to consultant, and that was very different for home life, wasn't it? Because I went from being out, so I'm working these days or this shifts, and being definitely at the hospital, to an on-call system where it feels very weird at first when you actually just walk out the door. You're on call, but you're allowed to leave.
Yeah, and I remember that. I mean, I think you're right, in some ways it was easier when you were like more junior, because you weren't there. I think when you were then a consultant, firstly, this idea that really you got to leave was a bit misleading. Cause I think it was when you became a consultant, you changed the shift patterns, didn't you, to go to 98 hours? Because the reality is no one was able to leave until about 10 at night anyway, because it's too busy. And then still the difficult bit was that the phone calls in the middle of the night, and I think normally you would answer directly. Sometimes I would answer, and they're like, "Oh, this is switchboard. Can we speak to Miss Wilcott, please?" And you talk to them, and it could sometimes be hard to get back to sleep afterwards. Sometimes I wouldn't even remember the fact they called. Yeah, and I still remember sometimes there'd be you'd say, "Okay, I'll be with you in 20 minutes," and then you'd get up and go off to work and may not come back. And in the morning, I'd be getting up with the kids and sort of saying, "Okay, yeah, mummy's, a bit later on." And actually, once again, you had to have times when the nanny would stay over, because if you were on call and I wasn't there, we had to have someone around in case you had to go in, because you couldn't leave the kids.
Yeah, and I remember it being difficult because I didn't want to wake you. And there's that thing that you've answer the phone and you've got to be awake enough to give some sensible advice or think through what you're being asked, but also try not to wake up everybody in the house. And I would usually have a pile of clothes on the floor by the bed so that I could literally just pull everything on and go in if I needed to. But it was very much leaving you holding the babies, as it were, because I wouldn't know whether I'd be gone for half an hour or 4 hours. It's impossible to say.
It's funny, the things I remember actually being more frustrated, it was less when you had to go in, because that was kind of like the job, and it was when some other part of the hospital was being difficult. When someone was refusing to, I don't know, do an x-ray or get involved, and you had to then start ringing round from home.
Yeah.
To sort of drag some other consultant out of. Usually what involved is some junior doctor was refusing to do something, and you'd speak to them first, and then every now and then you had to drag their consultant out of bed to get things sorted out. I remember that in some ways being more frustrating and more stressful than just going in, doing a cesarean, coming home thing. But yeah, I mean, with that, I always thought it was always part of the job. I suppose with hindsight, the bit I should have quizzed you about more at a time when we were sort of first going out is you didn't point out that Obs and Gynae has a much worse on-call rota than anything else. If I'd realised at the time that I would have maybe encouraged you to do dermatology or psychiatry's got a pretty easy. I hadn't realised that I think it's you and I suppose only A&E's worse, I suppose, isn't it?
Anaesthetics as well, I guess.
Anaesthetics is bad, yeah. But, some sort of medical specialty would have been a wiser choice, I think, in terms of sort of hours in bed at night.
Acute medicine's pretty bad, but I do agree. But I don't.
But I think ENT, very little on call and lots of private work. I really should lobby for that.
But I think you're right. We didn't discuss it, but I don't even think it was like. I think I was naive. I don't even think I really particularly thought about it either. It was just, I like this. I'm enjoying this. I'm going to do this. And that kind of came first. And I guess because when you make that decision, you're in your 20s or early 20s, you don't imagine, oh, I'm still going to be doing this in my 50s. Do you?
No.
So you don't kind of take that into consideration.
Yeah, no, it's like, when you're young, you think you'll live forever. It's one of those things.
Yeah. So do you think there's anything major? I remember going to a party when I was a new consultant, and one of the other spouses saying to you something about, you'll soon find out what it's like in the middle of the night. Do you have any kind of particular memories of things that you just thought, oh my God, what is she talking about? Or, oh, that's terrible. Or me being particularly stressed or annoyed with someone?
I don't remember the on-calls and things like that being that bad from my point of view, because I had a job where I was away a lot. So in that sense, having this time that I was forced to be responsible for the kids, I think was actually very good for me. And it stopped me becoming one of those fathers who's too distant, doesn't spend time with their kids. It was sort of there was no way that we could have one of those relationships where I was sort of the working man and you were the supportive wife. So I think that was extremely positive. And I think the thing with the NHS is it's not the hours per se. You get tired, and that would be difficult. And I remember that the years when you would be on call and have to go in the next day. Times that was just bonkers because you'd been up all night and go next day. So but that's not what gets you down. I think what gets you down is when you feel the system's not working for the patient. It's when it's the NHS is an enormous it's organisation. It's always stretched, always under resourced, and because it's an enormous organisation under an enormous amount of public scrutiny, it has to run procedures and standardisation and try and do things in certain ways. And at times that can you get the unintended consequences. Sometimes you think that's just bonkers. Why has that been done that way? How's that for the good of the patient? And I see that as much more upsetting and much more stressful for you than the sheer workload. The stuff that worries me much more is when I see you getting just so stressed and annoyed because just when the system seems to do stupid things.
Yeah.
Than the actual hours per se.
Yeah, the frustration of the bureaucracy definitely at times is, you're right, that's the source of the stress more than the clinical environment.
Yeah. And
the clinical environment can sometimes be very supportive, very, I was going to say nurturing, but I'm not sure that's quite the right word, but very, when you're working as part of a team, that can be very good.
Yeah. And often when you go in the middle of the night, in some ways, to be blunt, it's a lot less stressful because there's no management. You're basically in charge when you go in as a consultant. Everyone's going to fundamentally do what you say because they've called you in.
Yeah.
And also you're all focused on a patient because that's why you've been called in. You're not being called in because there's a problem with some audit data.
Yeah.
Right? And everyone's very focused on that. And I think you find that very fulfilling. You find that quite exciting. And if it wasn't the fact it's just physically quite grueling, I think in some ways that would be sort of almost like the best bit of the job.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
You've always, I think you've always loved being on labour ward and the sort of camaraderie and the excitement and the outcomes and everything else. And like you say, you never get called in the middle of the night for anything apart from obstetric issues.
Fabulous. So I normally end my episode with a zesty bit. A kind of take home, or what do I want people to remember from that specific episode? What do you think? Do you have anything in mind for a zesty bit from our conversation today?
I think two things sort of spring to mind. One is how being a doctor and being an obstetrician is a vocation. It's like being a priest. You either have a calling to it or you don't. And if you have a calling to it, then you'll do it anyway. And if you don't have that calling, I think you'll find it's very, very hard. And the other thing is that whenever I go to sort of an event or a dinner party to people, doctors are still held in probably the highest esteem in our society of almost any role. Doctors, nurses, and when I talk to people, I tell them I work in finance or work in the university, they're just sort of like, oh yeah, whatever. Yeah, and then my wife's an obstetrician. You can see in their faces that means something. That's important. That's I still get to bask in the reflected pride of that. So it's been a difficult journey at times. It's always been worth it.
Yeah, that sort of matches what I was going to say, because I was going to say, there's that card, behind every successful man is a slightly surprised woman.
Yeah.
And I wasn't going to say that, but I was going to say behind every successful obstetrician, midwife, or whatever other health professional is some sort of support, is a supportive partner or a supportive family. And actually, I definitely could not have achieved what I've achieved without you by my side, in terms of practical things, but also just being there when I'm exhausted, when I'm upset, or when I'm excited and pleased. So I do think that that's something not to be taken for granted, I guess.
It's been an honour.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mr ObsPod, for coming on. I very much hope you found this episode of the ObsPod interesting. If you have, it'd be fantastic if you could subscribe, rate and review on whatever platform you find your podcasts, as well as recommending the ObsPod to anyone you think might find it interesting. There's also tons of episodes to explore in my back catalogue, from clinical topics, my career and journey as an obstetrician, and life in the NHS more generally. I'd like to assure women I care for that I take confidentiality very seriously and take great care not to use any patient identifiable information unless I have expressly asked the permission of the person involved on that rare occasion when it's been absolutely necessary. If you found this episode interesting and want to explore the subject a little more deeply, don't forget to take a look at the programme notes where I've attached some links. If you want to get in touch to suggest topics for future episodes, you can find me at TheObsPod on Twitter and Instagram, and you can email me TheObsPod@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.